Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today, we're going deep on something that sounds straight out of a spy flick, piercing the corporate veil.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is. Think of a company as this impenetrable fortress.
Okay, yeah.
Piercing the veil. That's finding that secret passage, getting past all the defenses, and holding the people inside accountable for what the company does.
So, bypassing the legal shield, going after the masterminds, I like it.
Exactly. We've got 4 real-life cases from the Philippines to show just how this works. Pulled straight from the legal docs.
Ooh, juicy.
Oh, it gets messy. These cases show how wild the business world can really be. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right, case number 1. Total Petroleum Philippines Corporation versus Edgardo Lim. It all starts with a company called Pyre Plus. They've got a contract with Total Petroleum to sell their fuel.
Standard stuff, right?
Right, but there's a catch. This clause saying Pyre Plus can't just transfer this right to sell fuel to anybody without town. Total's okay. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, gotta protect your interests.
Now, here's where things get interesting. Pyre Plus decides to change their name to SuperPro. They tell Total, hey, no worries, it's just a name change. Nothing's changing.
Uh-oh. I feel like that's never the case.
You got it. Later, Total finds out SuperPro isn't just a renamed Pyre Plus. It's a whole new W company.
Sneaky. So that's a breach of contract, right?
You bet. But here's the big question. Can Pyre Plus's president, Edgardo Lim, be held liable personally, even though it was a company action? And that's where piercing the corporate veil comes in.
Ah, so this is where we get to the good stuff.
Because normally the company and the person running it are separate, right?
Right, separate entities in the eyes of the law. Means the company's debts, liabilities, they're not automatically the big boss's problem.
So what made this case different? Why'd Mr. Lim end up in the hot seat?
Well, the court looked closely at how Lim talked about the name change, and they decided, nope, this wasn't just a simple mix-up. His communication. Deliberately misleading.
Oh, so he was playing games.
Exactly. He created this illusion that Pyre Plus and SuperPro were basically the same. Led Total on, and that's bad faith, legally speaking. That deception. That's what made him personally responsible.
Wow, so it wasn't an accident. The court saw right through it. They're like, nope, you were trying to use the company to get away with breaking the rules.
Exactly. This case is a prime example of how the law can step in and say, you can't hide behind your company when you're pulling shady stuff.
Right. So dishonesty, that's a big red flag for the courts. It's not enough for things to just go wrong. There has to be that element of you knew what you were doing for them to pierce that veil.
Absolutely. Now let's switch gears a bit for case number 2. This one takes us back to the late 90s, right in the middle of the Asian financial crisis. Businesses everywhere were struggling.
Yeah, rough times.
It was, and our players this time are China Banking Corporation and St. Francis Square Realty Corporation, or SFSRC for short. SFSRC had taken out some big loans from China Bank, but then the crisis hit, and keeping up with those payments, oof, not easy.
So they were in a real bind, huh? Mountain of debt, economy in free fall. What could they even do?
They made a move, filed for corporate rehabilitation.
Rehabilitation, like a last-ditch effort.
Not quite. Think of it as a lifeline, helping companies get back on their feet. It's a legal process, a chance to restructure their debt, and hopefully get a fresh start.
So not just waving the white flag and calling it quits.
Nope, bankruptcy's the end of the line. Liquidating assets to pay off debts. Rehabilitation. It's about giving them a chance to fight another day. Restructure, get stable, and eventually pay back what they owe.
Okay, so a more optimistic route focused on recovery.
Exactly. So they file for rehabilitation, and the court issues a stay order.
Stay order. What's that do?
Think of it as a pause button. All those legal actions against the company, debt collection, everything freezes, gives SFSRC some breathing room to come up with a plan to get back on track.
Okay, so a timeout to regroup and figure things out. I get it. But where's the conflict? If everyone's on board with this plan, what's the issue?
Well, China Bank, as the lender, they were understandably a bit anxious. Where's our money? You know? They argued that even with the stay order, interest should still be adding up on those loans.
So even though SFSRC was trying to recover, China Bank still wanted their cut. Ouch.
Right. But SFSRC fired back, saying, hold on, if interest keeps piling up during rehabilitation, what's the point? We'll never get ahead. They believe the stay order should cover everything, including interest.
Sounds like a real standoff, both sides with valid points. So who won?
The court sided with SFSRC. They ruled that China Bank had to play by the rules of the rehabilitation plan. The plan had specific instructions for how those loans would be settled, and that took priority over China Bank's demands for interest.
Interesting. So a win for SFSRC and for the idea of giving struggling companies a real chance at a comeback.
Exactly. Sometimes it takes compromise from both sides to make things work.
Okay, case number 3, and this one's a doozy. We got the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, going after AZ 1731 Realty, Inc. And get this company was formed with a dead person listed as one of the founders.
Wait, what? How does that even happen?
Right. It sounds crazy, but just because someone's passed away doesn't automatically mean the whole thing was a scam.
Oh, okay. So it could be an honest mistake.
Exactly. Mistakes happen, especially with paperwork as complicated as incorporating a business. The court had to figure out, was this intentional or just a big oops?
Makes sense. So what did they find? Was AZ 1731 Realty trying to pull a fast one?
The court looked into it and concluded AZ 1731 Realty had real business goals, the resources to operate, even without that deceased person involved. It seemed like a clerical error, not some scheme to cheat anyone.
So a slap on the wrist and a fix your paperwork kind of deal.
Basically, they were ordered to amend their documents, remove the deceased person's name, and make sure any assets or shares were handled properly.
Sounds like the court was focused on intent. They didn't see malicious intent, just a big ol' mistake.
Right. And that brings us to our final case for this part of our deep dive, Kong versus spouses Wanda Galang. This one's about the joys and pitfalls of homeownership.
Ah, the American dream with all its complexity.
Exactly. So the Galangs, they take out a loan to buy a house, the loan secured by the property, standard stuff. But then one of the spouses loses their job, and bam, they fall behind on payments.
Job loss, that's a tough blow. Can really throw everything off balance.
For sure. And even though they eventually catch up on those payments, the bank, HSBC SRP, which is a subsidiary of HSBC, decides to foreclose.
Foreclosure, that's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Losing your home, even after catching up, that's gotta be rough.
Absolutely. Feeling like they've been treated unfairly, the Galangs fight back. They argue that HSBC SRP acted in bad faith, trying to grab their property even though they were trying to make things right. They even question whether HSBC SRP and his parent company, HSBC, were working together to take advantage of them.
So it gets even more complicated. Bringing in the parent company. This is where piercing the corporate veil gets really interesting.
It does. A subsidiary, like HSBC SRP, is usually treated as its own separate thing from the parent company. But the Galangs were hoping the court would see it differently in their case.
So did they. Did the court find HSBC pulling strings behind the scenes?
They dug deep into that relationship between HSBC SRP and HSBC. But they didn't find proof of any sneaky dealings or deliberate attempts to hurt the Galangs. To pierce the corporate veil, they needed clear evidence of fraud or the parent company using the subsidiary for shady stuff. And that evidence just wasn't there.
So a tough break for the Galangs. Even though their situation was difficult, the court said the foreclosure was a result of the loan agreement, not some corporate conspiracy.
Exactly. It highlights how important it is to understand those loan agreements, especially when it comes to something as big as your home.
Absolutely. It's a lesson in the power of contracts. Knowing what you're signing, because sometimes, even when life throws curveballs, the legal system can be unforgiving.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the fine print, the agreements we sign, and how much power they hold.
It does. Sometimes those consequences, they can be pretty serious, even when things go wrong due to things outside your control.
Food for thought. But we're just getting started. We've got a whole lot more to uncover about piercing the corporate veil. Stick around, because this deep dive is about to get even deeper. Some pretty intense cases, right? Real people, real companies, and some tough decisions with real consequences.
Absolutely. They really highlight that constant struggle, balancing the need for accountability with protecting those involved in a company.
Yeah, it's like this legal tightrope walk. On one side, you've got limited liability, shielding company owners from being personally responsible for debts. But on the other side, you got to hold people accountable when they mess up, especially if it's intentional.
It is a delicate balance, for sure. Courts have to carefully consider every single detail, the context, everything, to decide if piercing the veil is the right move. It's not something they take lightly.
Definitely not as simple as it sounds at first. Lots of nuance, lots of factors to weigh.
That's part of what makes this area of law so fascinating. It's not just blindly following rules. It's about understanding the reasoning behind those rules and applying them to all sorts of situations, some of them pretty unexpected.
And as we saw, courts are willing to pierce that veil when there's clear evidence of wrongdoing.
Hmm.
But they also get the importance of the corporate structure. They're not just going to toss it aside lightly.
Exactly. It's not about saying corporations are bad. It's about making sure people don't exploit that structure, using it as a shield to avoid consequences for their actions, especially when those actions are harmful.
It's like sending a message. You can't hide behind your company if you're doing something wrong. We'll find a way to hold you accountable.
Exactly. Now, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on all this? What do these cases tell us about the power dynamics between individuals and these big corporations?
Hmm, that's a good question. On one hand, it's reassuring to see individuals can be held responsible, even when they're acting on behalf of a company. But it also seems like it can be really tough to prove wrongdoing, especially when you're up against a corporation with tons of resources.
Yeah, that's a valid point. These cases show that the law does offer ways to hold people accountable, but the burden of proof, it often falls on the person who was harmed. And getting that proof when you're going up against a powerful corporation, well, that can feel like an uphill battle.
Makes you wonder, right? How many times does corporate wrongdoing just go unchecked because individuals don't have the resources or the know-how to fight back?
It's a real concern. It raises the question, do we need stronger safeguards? Better ways to prevent these abuses and support those who've been hurt by unethical corporate actions?
They need even more transparency within these big companies, so it's easier to spot and address problems before they blow up.
Possibly. But we also can't forget that corporations are a huge part of our economy. They create jobs, they come up with new products and services, they drive innovation. So the challenge is finding that sweet spot, promoting economic growth while preventing abuse.
It's about making sure businesses can thrive, but also making sure individuals' rights and interests are protected. It's a tough balance.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the key takeaways here? What should our listeners remember?
Well, first off, these cases show piercing the corporate veil isn't just some legal theory. It's a real tool that courts can use to hold individuals responsible for what happens under their company's name.
Absolutely. It's not about demonizing corporations. It's about understanding that corporate structure, while beneficial, shouldn't be a free pass to act unethically or illegally.
It's a reminder that actions have consequences, even within a company. You can be held personally liable, especially if those actions are intentionally harmful or deceptive.
Exactly. And these cases also highlight the importance of ethical business practices. When people cut corners, prioritize personal gain over doing the right thing, they're putting themselves at risk.
It's not just about avoiding legal trouble. It's about building a business, a career, on a foundation of integrity, making responsible choices.
Absolutely. And finally, these cases remind us that the relationship between individuals and corporations is complex. The law provides a framework to navigate that complexity, but understanding how it all works is crucial.
Knowledge is power, right? The more you know about these legal principles, the better equipped you are to protect yourself and hold others accountable.
I couldn't agree more. Now, before we move on, I have a question for you. Given the potential for abuse, do you think there should be stricter rules to prevent people from hiding behind the corporate veil? Or would that stifle innovation and economic growth?
That's a tough one. It's all about finding that balance, isn't it? Encouraging people to take risks, start businesses, contribute to the economy, but also having safeguards in place to prevent those same structures from being used for the wrong reasons.
Precisely. There's no easy answer, no magic solution. It takes careful thought, smart policies, and a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone.
So it's not just about more rules and regulations. It's about fostering a culture of responsibility within the business world itself.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where businesses are encouraged to operate ethically, not just legally. And that's a conversation that needs to include everyone. Business leaders, policymakers, investors, everyday people.
A collective effort, then, a shared responsibility to create a business world that's both dynamic and ethical.
Exactly. Now, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's shift gears a bit and look towards the future. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how technology might impact this whole concept of piercing the corporate veil going forward.
It's interesting. Technology is always changing, right?
Yeah.
And with it, the way businesses operate, the way they interact with the world, it seems like the law would have to adapt too.
Yeah, it does feel like we're entering this whole new world. I mean, online, the lines between who's a person and who's a company, It's getting blurry. What do you think? How's that going to change things for piercing the corporate veil down the road?
That's the million-dollar question. It's something legal experts are really wrestling with right now.
Yeah.
See, as we dive deeper into this digital world, these online platforms, these virtual companies, they're shaking things up.
Right. The old rules might not apply anymore.
Exactly. The traditional boundaries of a corporation, they're becoming more and more fluid. Think about DAOs, for example, decentralized autonomous organizations.
DAOs. Those are what, like companies run by algorithms?
Basically,
Yeah.
it's a whole new way of organizing a business, and they challenge our legal systems in some pretty fundamental ways.
So it's like the law is trying to catch up with all this new tech. It is. It's a constant race. The challenge is going to be figuring out how to adapt, how to ensure accountability in this new landscape. We might see entirely new legal tests or standards pop up to deal with these digital entities.
So piercing the corporate veil, this concept that's been around for ages, it might need a makeover to stay relevant.
It might. The principles, they're still crucial, holding people accountable, making sure they don't hide behind their companies to do wrong. But how we apply those principles to, say, a DAO, that's going to require some fresh thinking.
It's almost like we're seeing the birth of a whole new area of law, one that's built for the digital age.
It's definitely an exciting time to be a lawyer. We need new solutions, right? Ones that address the unique challenges of these digital business structures while still sticking to those core values of fairness and accountability.
So for our listeners who might be wondering, okay, but how does this affect ME? What's the big takeaway here?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. This legal principle, it's about protecting people. It's about fairness. Whether it's a traditional company or some cutting-edge digital creation, the idea is the same. Individuals are responsible for their actions. They can't use a company in any form to escape the consequences.
So even in this crazy digital world, accountability still matters. Fairness still matters.
Absolutely. And as new ways of doing business come along, the legal system will have to keep up. It'll have to adapt to make sure those principles are upheld.
It's like law is this living, breathing thing,
Yeah.
always evolving with the times.
That's a great way to put it. And as we become more and more reliant on technology, figuring out how to apply legal concepts like piercing the corporate veil, that's going to be critical for creating a future that's innovative and just.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from contracts to the metaverse and everything in between. It's been a fascinating journey exploring how this seemingly obscure legal idea plays such a big role in making sure the business world plays fair.
It has been a pleasure. These cases, the bigger picture, it's all really thought-provoking.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these legal principles, the better equipped we are to handle whatever the business world throws at us. Until next time, stay curious.
All right, so get this. We're going deep into Philippine Supreme Court rulings, all about taxation, and these are all from 2020 and 2021. You gave us some interesting cases to look at today.
Yeah, there are some real gems in here. From government agencies kind of going head-to-head to companies, trying to find those tax loopholes. It's fascinating to see how these cases, even though they're specific to the Philippines, really highlight those universal struggles in taxation.
Right. It's always that balance, isn't it? The government needs money to function. Individual rights and fairness have to be considered too. And then there's just the challenge of applying the law in the real world where things are messy.
It never is as neat and tidy as the textbooks make it seem.
Okay, so should we jump right in? We've got a lot to cover.
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right, so first up, we've got Abejo v. COA. Now, this one's a case that shows how even when you think you're doing everything by the book, things can still go wrong.
Oh, absolutely. This case really revolves around the Commission on Audit, the COA, which is like the financial watchdog for the government. They uncovered some bonuses that were, well, they exceeded a cap that had been put in place, and that's when things got a little sticky.
So for our listener who maybe isn't familiar with all the ins and outs of Philippine government agencies, break this down for us. Who's Abejo and what were these bonuses all about?
Sure. So Bernadette Lourdes-Abreu was the executive director of the Insurance Commission Accreditation Board, or ICAB. Now, back in 2011, they granted these CNA incentives, basically bonuses, based on a circular from the Department of Budget and Management, the DBM.
Okay, so the DBM issues these circulars that act as a kind of instructions, right?
Right. Think of it as a set of guidelines from a higher authority. And this particular circular, it allowed for these one-time benefits, but only after the fiscal year ended and if certain programs were completed. So, on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I can see how they'd think they were following the rules. So where did things go off track?
Well, see, the ICAB made two payments towards these bonuses in November and December of 2011.
Okay.
But then, get this, on December 26th, literally right after Christmas, the DBM issued a new circular.
No, no.
This one set a cap of 25,000 pesos per employee for those incentives.
Ah, I see where this is going. So they paid out the bonuses before knowing about the cap, but the COA still flagged them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The COA issued what's called a notice of disallowance for the excess amount, which ended up being over 236,500 pesos.
Wow.
Abejo argued that she couldn't have known about this new circular coming, but in the end, the Supreme Court sided with the COA.
So even though she thought she was doing the right thing, she was held personally liable for that overpayment.
It really underscores the, how do I put this, the seriousness of following guidelines in government, especially when it comes to finances.
Makes sense. It's taxpayer money, after all.
Right. Even if your intentions are good, not knowing the rules or even just timing issues, they don't really fly as a defense.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about the balance between holding individuals accountable and having these, sometimes rigid systems.
Absolutely. It definitely raises some questions about whether that strict interpretation really achieves justice in every case.
Yeah, food for thought. Okay, let's move on to a case that's, well, it's almost like a David and Goliath situation. We've got the Philippine Heart Center v. Quezon City. Here's a nationally vital hospital, and they're being pursued for property taxes by the city they operate in.
It's a real clash of priorities, isn't it? You've got the Philippine Heart Center, which is, this government instrumentality, so part of the national government, but with a little more independence,
Yeah.
and providing essential cardiovascular care, especially for people who can't afford the high costs of private treatment. And they were initially granted tax-exempt status, which makes sense given what they do.
Right. Their mission is to provide this crucial public service, so giving them a tax break seems logical. But then the city of Quezon City comes after them for what must be a massive amount in property taxes.
Yeah, we're talking millions.
It seems almost cruel, to go after a hospital like that.
Well, this is where that classic dilemma comes in. The city argued that they desperately needed that revenue to fund their own essential services for their residents.
Makes sense.
On the other hand, the Philippine Heart Center, they stood firm, saying, look, we're tax exempt, and for good reason. We're providing this vital health care. It's a national need.
So how did they fight back, legally speaking? What was their strategy?
They really played up their unique legal position, you see. While they're a government instrumentality, they also have these corporate powers, which allows them to operate more autonomously. So it's like this hybrid status, which actually ended up being crucial in the Supreme Court's decision.
Okay, so how did the Supreme Court untangle this mess? You've got national interests on one side, local interests on the other. It's got to be tricky.
Well, in the end, they sided with the Philippine Heart Center, and they lean heavily on a key legal principle. Local governments, they can't impose taxes on the national government.
So because the PHC's properties are essentially government assets?
Right. They were deemed exempt from those real property taxes, which was a big win for the PHC, but also set a major precedent for how these national government entities are taxed.
This case had implications way beyond just one hospital's tax bill, didn't it? It established a broader rule about who can tax who.
Exactly, and it really highlights how something as seemingly dry as a legal battle over taxes can actually impact something as vital as access to health care, especially for the less fortunate.
It's all connected. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a case involving a company with, well, let's just say a colorful history. It's the City of Davao v. AP Holdings case, and this one takes us into the world of corporate maneuvering and government intervention.
Oh, AP Holdings. Yeah, this one's a doozy. To really get this case, we have to talk about the Coconut Industry Investment Fund, or CIIF. This fund, they had invested in, wait for it, San Miguel Corporation.
Oh, no way, the San Miguel Corporation.
One and only.
Yeah.
The massive food and beverage conglomerate.
Okay, hold on, there's more to this, right? Didn't these shares get, seized by the government or something?
You're on the right track. The shares in San Miguel Corporation that were held by AP Holdings, they were sequestered, meaning taken over, by the Presidential Commission on Good Government. This was back in the 1980s. And there's been this whole legal battle going on over who actually owns those shares, and it's still going on today.
It's like a soap opera with corporate intrigue. So where does the city of Davao come into all of this?
Well, even with this whole ownership mess going on, the city of Davao still wanted their business taxes from AP Holdings on the dividends they got from those very shares.
So they were like, look, we don't care who owns them, we just want our cut.
Pretty much. But here's the catch. There was a big question about whether AP Holdings was even the right type of company to be taxed in this way.
I'm guessing it wasn't as straightforward as it seemed.
Not at all. You see, AP Holdings technically was set up as a holding company, not a financial institution. So the big question was it actually acting like a bank or some kind of financial intermediary? Or was that just a technicality, something on paper? That's what the Supreme Court had to figure out.
So was AP Holdings trying to, like, dodge taxes by saying, oh, we're not a financial institution? What was their angle?
Well, surprisingly, the Supreme Court sided with AP Holdings.
Hmm.
They found that even though the company's articles of incorporation had some clauses that suggested financial activities,
Okay.
those activities weren't its main purpose, and it wasn't doing them regularly. Plus, they reiterated that those shares, regardless of the ownership confusion, were basically government assets.
So taxing the dividends would be like taxing the government itself?
You got it, and that's a big no-no.
Wow. So this wasn't just about one company trying to avoid taxes, was it? This set a precedent for how all these CIIF holding companies are taxed locally?
Huge implications. It clarified that these companies, when it comes to dividends, specifically from those SMC shares, they're not subject to those local business taxes. And that ripples through a whole sector of the Philippine economy.
Wow. Okay. So from corporate maneuvering to a case that, well, it might seem a bit obscure at first, but it really does impact everyone. We're talking about Association of International Shipping Lines v. Secretary of Finance. This one's about those hidden costs that end up affecting the prices we pay for everyday goods.
This one dives deep into the world of international shipping. Specifically, we're talking about demurrage and detention fees.
Okay, I'll admit, I'm not familiar with those terms.
Yeah.
Break it down for our listener. What are these fees and why should we care?
All right, so imagine you're renting a car, right? But you get stuck in traffic for hours. You still have to pay for that extra time, even though it wasn't really your fault, yeah.
Yeah, that's the worst. So is that what demurrage and detention are? Like extra fees for when things are delayed?
Exactly. Now, think about those giant container ships that come into ports. Sometimes there are delays, congestion, problems with paperwork, all sorts of things. And those delays, they cost money. That's where demurrage and detention come in. Demurrage is like rent for the shipping container if it sits at the port longer than agreed. And detention is a penalty for using the container outside the port for too long.
So if those fees go up, the costs get passed on to businesses and then eventually to us, the consumers.
Right.
Everything from, I don't know, electronics to clothes could get more expensive.
You got it. And that's why this case is so important. The question was, are these fees subject to regular income tax? Or do they fall under this special tax regime for international shipping?
Ah, so it's technicality, but with potentially huge financial consequences.
Exactly. It can have a real impact on businesses' bottom lines and, like you said, our wallets.
Yeah.
So what did the Supreme Court decide?
Yeah, spill the beans. What's the verdict?
They ruled that these fees are subject to regular income tax.
So no special treatment for shipping companies on these fees?
Nope. They have to pay their fair share. It might seem like a niche issue, but it clarifies which taxes apply to specific types of income, even in really complex industries.
So good news for the taxman, I guess, but also good news for clarity and fairness in the system.
Exactly, and it shows how interconnected things are. What might seem like a technicality for a shipping company can have ripple effects throughout the economy.
Okay, I'm ready for our final case in this part. This one's another showdown, but this time between a government agency and the taxman himself. It's CIRV basis conversion. And it all revolves around, get this, prime real estate, big money from land sales. And the big question, are those profits taxable if the seller is a government agency?
Oh yeah, this one's a good one. So picture this. Bonifacio Global City in Taguig City. Skyscrapers, prime real estate, the whole 9 yards.
I'm picturing it.
The Basis Conversion and Development Authority, or BCDA, that's the government agency in charge of transforming former military bases into these bustling economic zones.
Okay.
And they sold off 4 properties, the expanded Big Delta lots, for a cool 2 billion pesos.
Wow, that's a lot of zeros. So I'm guessing the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the CIR, wanted their piece of the pie?
You would think. But here's where it gets interesting. The Net Group, the joint venture that bought the properties, they withheld a portion of the payment as creditable withholding tax. So they were assuming that the BCDA owed taxes on that sale.
Makes sense, right? I mean, that's a huge chunk of change.
Right. But hold on. The BCDA argued that they were exempt.
Wait, hold up. How can a government agency selling off such valuable land claim a tax exemption? That seems a little, I don't know, fishy.
It's a bold move, for sure.
Yeah.
But they had a legal argument, and it hinged on what happened to the money from the sale.
Okay, I'm listening.
Wow.
What was their reasoning?
They said, look, this money isn't just going into our general funds. These funds were specifically earmarked, meaning designated by law, for very particular purposes and beneficiaries.
So they were saying, this isn't profit, it's already assigned for other uses.
Exactly. It's like the money had a predetermined destination from the moment those properties were sold.
Yeah.
And this is where those legal complexities come in, right? You've got general tax laws that apply to most transactions, but then you've got these specific exemptions that are granted to certain entities, like the BCDA in this case, for specific properties.
It's like a legal chess match. So did the Supreme Court buy the BCDA's argument? Or did they side with the tax man? What happened?
Well, that's a story for part two.
All right, welcome back to the show. We left off on quite the cliffhanger, didn't we? We were in the thick of this legal battle between the CIR and the BCDA over whether profits from the sale of those prime properties were actually taxable.
Oh, absolutely. This case, it really digs into what's considered taxable income, especially when you're talking about a government agency. It's not your typical business, right?
So did the Supreme Court buy the BCDA's argument? You know, that whole thing about the money being earmarked for specific purposes and not really being profit?
Well, in a decision that might raise some eyebrows, they actually sided with the BCDA.
Yeah.
Seriously. So the government can just sell off valuable land and not pay a single peso in taxes. How is that even possible?
It all boils down to that principle of not taxing the government itself, remember? We touched on this earlier. The BCDA isn't like some private corporation trying to make a buck for its shareholders.
Right. They're a government agency operating under a specific mandate from Congress.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, they basically said, look, because the proceeds from this sale were already designated by law for certain uses, it's not really the BCDA's income in the traditional sense.
So it's almost like they were just acting as a middleman, just moving funds around that already had a set destination.
Yeah, it's as if that money already had a label on it. You know, this goes here, this goes there, right from the moment those properties were sold. And to really hammer home their point, the Supreme Court brought up another interesting case. Bloomberry Resorts and Hotels, Inc. v. Bureau of Internal Revenue.
Bloomberry. Isn't that a casino? What does a casino have to do with the BCDA selling land?
Good catch. In the Bloomberry case, the company, which runs a casino, was also granted a tax exemption. But this wasn't on just any revenue. It was specifically on their gaming revenue.
Okay.
And why? Because of a very specific provision in the PAD-Core Charter, which is the law that governs casinos in the Philippines. It basically carved out this exemption for them.
Ah, so there's a precedent here. If there's a specific law that says this is exempt, even if it seems to go against those general tax principles, that specific law wins out.
That's the takeaway. These cases really show how important it is to understand the nuances of the law, all the little details. It's not always as simple as income equals taxes, you know. Sometimes there are these specific laws that create unique situations.
It's all about context, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's where we need experts to break it all down for us. So we've talked about bonuses, property taxes, corporate maneuvering, even international shipping fees. What other surprises does the world of Philippine tax law have in store for us?
I feel like I'm on a treasure hunt for legal loopholes.
Well, you gave us some great cases, you know, ones that really show how tax law touches so many parts of everyday life in the Philippines.
Right. It's not just some abstract concept. It's something that impacts everyone in one way or another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And each case, it offers a unique perspective on how the whole system works, how it functions.
I think that's something I really want our listener to take away from this, you know. It's not just legal mumbo-jumbo, these cases. Even though they deal with very specific scenarios,
Yeah.
they reveal these broader principles that apply to everyone, right? Whether you're a business owner or just someone trying to understand your own tax obligations.
Absolutely. Understanding those principles, it can be super valuable for anyone trying to navigate the system.
Yeah.
Whether you're earning a salary, running a company, whatever it is.
Knowledge is power, as they say, especially when it comes to something as potentially confusing as taxes.
No doubt. So are we ready to tackle the last case? I'm feeling like a tax detective, ready for the next mystery.
Let's do it. Bring on the intrigue.
All right, well, the final case we have is, it's fascinating because it deals with, well, it's kind of a murky area, ownership disputes and how they impact taxation. It's the case of CIR v. Philinvest Development Corporation.
Philinvest Development Corporation. Okay, I'm intrigued already. Tell me more. What got them tangled up with the CIR?
All right, so Philinvest, they're a major player in real estate in the Philippines, among other industries. In this case, it goes back to a transaction from 1995. That's when they acquired shares in a company called Manila Mandarin Hotel, Inc.
So we're talking a hotel, shares, and a tax dispute. I'm already sensing this is going to be complicated.
Buckle up. This is where it gets really
Yeah.
interesting. See, a few years after that acquisition, the Presidential Commission on Good Government, the PCGG, remember them from the AP Holdings case?
Oh, yeah, the ones who recover asset?
Right. They swooped in and said, hold on a second. Those shares that Philinvest acquired, they actually belong to the government.
Wait, what? So Philinvest bought shares that turned out to be government property. How does that even happen?
It's a long story. It involves the Marcos era and all that alleged ill-gotten wealth. But the key point is that the PCGG, as part of their mission to recover assets that were, basically stolen from the Filipino people, they asserted ownership over those shares.
Wow, talk about a plot twist.
Yeah.
So what did the CIR want from Philinvest in all of this?
Well, when Philinvest acquired those shares back in '95, they paid a certain amount for them, right? The CIR argued that this acquisition cost should have been subject to a documentary stamp tax.
Okay, time for a quick explainer for our listener. A documentary stamp tax, it's basically a tax on certain documents, like deeds or contracts. It's a way for the government to collect revenue on transactions. So the CIR was saying Philinvest should have paid this tax when they bought those shares, even though it later turned out they were government property.
You got it. And to make matters even more complicated, those shares were technically under litigation, meaning there was a legal battle going on.
Right.
That ownership dispute between Philinvest and the PCGG, it hadn't been settled yet.
So the CIR was trying to tax a transaction where the ownership of the stuff being bought and sold was still up in the air. That seems like a risky move.
It is. And that's the very question the Supreme Court had to grapple with. Can you slap a documentary stamp tax on a transaction when you don't even know for sure who owns the asset?
That's a good question. So what did they decide?
This case is full of twists and turns, and the Supreme Court's decision just adds another layer. We'll unpack their ruling and what it means for cases like this in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. We've covered so much ground today, from government agencies to massive corporations, even those giant cargo ships. And of course, who could forget that cliffhanger we left off on? The CIR v. Philinvest Development Corporation case, where things got really murky with that whole ownership dispute.
Yeah, that was a wild one. Just to recap for our listener, we're talking about Philinvest buying those shares in Manila Mandarin Hotel, and then the PCG coming in and saying, hold on, those belong to the government.
It's like a legal thriller. So the CIR wanted to impose that documentary stamp tax on Philinvest, even though it wasn't even clear if Philinvest rightfully owned those shares. What did the Supreme Court have to say about that?
Well, get this. They actually sided with Philinvest.
Really? So they said you can't impose a tax when the ownership of the asset is still up in the air, like while there's a lawsuit going on.
Precisely. They ruled that imposing that tax in a situation like that would be premature and could lead to all sorts of legal headaches later on.
It makes sense. It wouldn't be fair to tax a transaction if you don't even know who owns the thing being transacted.
Right. The court recognized the unique circumstances of that ownership dispute. They basically said, let's figure out who owns the shares first, then we can talk about taxes.
So it's like hitting the pause button on the tax bill until that ownership question is settled. Did the Supreme Court say what happens if, down the line, it's determined that Philinvest actually does own the shares?
Oh, they did. They clarified that if Philinvest ends up being declared the rightful owner, then yeah, that documentary stamp tax would become due. It's like a conditional tax, dependent on the outcome of that lawsuit.
Interesting. This ruling, it feels like it could have implications beyond just Philinvest. There must be other situations where the ownership of assets is unclear or being challenged in court.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This sets a major precedent for similar cases. It provides some much-needed guidance on how taxes should be handled in these kinds of messy situations.
Clarity is key, especially in tax law. This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of how complex and nuanced tax law really is. It's not just about crunching numbers, it's about interpretation, context, even a bit of legal detective work.
Couldn't have said it better myself. These cases, they show that tax law is constantly evolving. It's dynamic, it's responsive to new situations, and the courts play a huge role in shaping how those laws are applied in the real world.
Before we wrap up, let's talk about our listener. What are some key takeaways you'd want them to walk away with? What have we learned from all these cases?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say never underestimate the importance of clarity in tax law. Whether you're running a business, earning a salary, or just trying to understand your own tax obligations, knowing the rules of the game is crucial.
We saw firsthand how even tiny details, specific legal provisions, can have a huge impact on the outcome.
Another big one is staying informed. Tax laws are constantly changing. New laws are passed, old ones are amended, and court decisions like the ones we discussed today can reinterpret existing provisions. It's a dynamic landscape, so you got to keep up.
Yeah, what was true a few years ago might be completely different now. Don't rely on outdated information.
And lastly, don't hesitate to seek professional advice if you need it. This stuff can get complicated, and having a tax expert on your side can make all the difference.
Great advice. Well, this deep dive has been quite the journey, hasn't it? We've seen how battles over taxes can impact everyone, from big government agencies to multinational corporations, and even trickle down to affect the prices we pay for everyday things.
Absolutely, it's been fascinating to explore these cases with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Philippine tax law. We hope you learned something new and maybe even found it a bit entertaining. Until next time.